So now it's time to flip over to the other side of the debate with the position that's taken and really radicalized by Martin Luther. Over on the Orthodox side, I said divine impassibility determines our view of the cross. Well, Luther runs the logic in the other direction. Instead of the category of God's immortality determining our view of the cross is going to determine our view of God's passibility. The cross shows us God being God. And the God it shows us being God is transcendently different from the kinds of gods, the kinds of theologies that we've constructed, from our assumptions of what God must be like. And Luther will appeal to texts like this one in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. For since, in the wisdom of God, the world didn't know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For, now here we are in verse 25, for the foolishness of God is wiser than human beings, and the weakness of God is stronger than human beings. What does he mean by folly and weakness? He means Christ crucified. How does Jesus overpower all powers? Here on the cross, in weakness, in death. For Luther, this is the window into God's mystery. I'm going to give you a little snapshot of Luther's theology of the cross. This is what this comes to be called, the theology of the cross. And it's counterposed with what Luther just dismissively calls a theology of glory, so-called glory. God is just super big and super powerful. You know, there needs to be a Pixar movie about God because God would be an awesome character in that movie. That's what Luther would call a theology of glory. I'm going to read you Theses 19 to 24 of the Heidelberg Disputation of 1518. This is a crisp, radical dose of Protestant theology. That person doesn't deserve to be called a theologian who looks upon the invisible things of God as though they were clearly perceptible in those things that have actually happened. What are the invisible things of God? Those are things that Paul in Romans 1 says his transcendence and his invisibility, his divine attributes. Somebody who describes those straightforwardly isn't a real theologian. He's a poser theologian. A theologian of glory. One deserves to be called a theologian, however, who comprehends the visible and manifest things of God seen through the suffering and the cross. A real theologian sees God through the cross, not through philosophical abstractions. Philosophical abstractions didn't get us to understanding who God was. A theology of glory calls evil good and good evil. Right? It was a theology of glory that put Jesus on the cross, saying, you can't be legitimate, you can't be the Son of God, you can't be the Messiah, you can't be the Son of Man. Crucify him. That was calling evil good and good evil. A theology of the cross calls the thing what it actually is. The centurion is the only one who sees this man was the Son of God. He's the only theologian of the cross in the whole story. The story of Jesus is the story of the foolishness of God making foolish the wisdom of the wise. It's the story of the weakness of God overcoming the power and the strength of the Roman Empire, the leaders of Israel, the plausibility structures of his own followers, the mob power of the crowds. Okay? You might say then that the story of Jesus doesn't so much show us a strong God strengthening a weak humanity as a weak God, a God whose power and strength isn't like ours, extinguishing the false strength of a supposedly strong humanity. The picture that I'm going to give you here, it's not a Lutheran icon of the crucifixion, it's an earlier Catholic icon, and a famous one. Grunewald's crucifixion scene from the Isenheim altarpiece. It's a pretty different look, isn't it? Jesus doesn't look serene. He doesn't look in control. I'm going to read you Mark's account of the crucifixion, where they mock him and they say, "Come down from the cross," and he says nothing. There's no repentant thief on the cross in Mark. There's just contempt. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which is Psalm 22, verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Doesn't say that in Luke. And some of the bystanders hearing it misunderstood it. He's calling Elijah. And one ran and, filling a sponge full of vinegar, he put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Well, Elijah never came. Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. "No, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." Just agony. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that he thus breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." That's Mark's scene. It sounds more like this picture, doesn't it? Look at Jesus in agony. Look at the hands. As I said before, look at the way the weight, guilt, bends the crossbeam. This is the icon I was referring to earlier. And over here, out of the timeline, you have John the Baptist pointing to him, saying, "He must increase and I must decrease." And at the very bottom right, the lamb looking as though it's slain, whose blood is trickling into a communion cup. Karl Barth had it hanging above his desk, staring at him as he wrote, because he was profoundly dedicated to a theology of the cross. Here, what is kenosis? Jürgen Moltmann took one position on kenosis, kind of a hyper-Lutheran position. He said, kenosis is God's nature. Self-emptying is the very nature of God. God is such profound love that is how God expresses himself. This is not a duck who won't quack or fly or swim. This is a duck who's quacking like crazy. Jesus is displaying who God is, and who God is radical, self-emptying love in his nature. A more nuanced position comes from a Catholic theologian of the 20th century, Hans Urs von Balthasar. Kenosis, self-emptying, is how Christ expresses his being the second person of the Trinity, his being begotten of the Father, by emptying himself, taking the form of a servant, being obedient even unto death. And the way the Father expresses his begettingness is by lavishing glory on him, giving him the name above every name. You have here a revelation of the personhood of the Son, and through it, the personhood of all three persons in the radical communion of God's love. One last question. Do you have to choose between these two? Well, yes, in a way you have to. I mean, they can't both narrate straightforwardly the same story in such different ways. But there's a line from a Wesley hymn that I think gets at what's best about both accounts. From Wesley's hymn, "And Can It Be?" comes the line, "He emptied himself of all but love," which is a way of saying that the cross shows us both what God isn't like and what God is like, but in different respects. And props to Jürgen Moltmann here. He's a German Reformed theologian of the mid to late 20th century. Either way, no matter where you are on this chart, in this lecture, in this debate, The cross revolutionizes our concept of God. Maybe more radically on the right, maybe less radically on the left, but truly no matter what. A Christian who doesn't go to the cross to understand who God is isn't doing Christian theology.